that NATO is also relevant for the present and for the future. And it's exactly, I think, the second reason or the second explanation why NATO still exists, because not only was it, good during the Cold War, not only was it always, not only did it always respect its member countries, but also it was capable of reforming itself, adapting itself to the current and future challenges and circumstances. In the 1990s, it was basically being ready to act outside of the alliance territory, in particular in the Balkans. There was a big debate whether NATO should be actually acting outside of its member countries' territory, which nobody really considered until then, because during the Cold War, NATO was a sort of a stationary organization. We never planned any military organization on the territory of our adversary, or massive ground operations. But now the question was what to do in case or in a situation where of an ethnic conflict, such as the one in former Yugoslavia, and the international community, including NATO, didn't really have the answer for a number of years. In Bosnia first, and in Bosnia, the result of that hesitation, lack of resolve, was that in the end, in 1995. When the conflict in Bosnia was finally put an end to, there was about 100,000 dead people. The worst tragedy, the bloodiest conflict in Europe since the end of the Cold War. Really, and I'm talking about civilians here. 100,000 dead. 100,000 civilians dead at the end of the conflict, and and I know that many criticize NATO for what it did in Kosovo a few years later, but you cannot understand why NATO did what she did in Kosovo without understanding the lesson learned from Bosnia, where indeed nothing was done for a number of years, and the result was awful, was tragic. So in fact, when the situation started to deteriorate in Kosovo, there was a willingness to take measures. Unfortunately, without the explicit Security Council mandate in 1999. But indeed, the air campaign, which was conducted by NATO from March 99 until June, prevented a similar tragedy possibly happening in Kosovo. So one has to understand it in this context. That was one thing, in the 90s, sort of adapting to the ethnic conflict outside of adapting to be able to conduct peacekeeping and peace enforcement missions outside of its member territory. The other thing was also NATO enlargement, because a number of countries expressed their willingness, their desire, and worked hard to actually become NATO members. NATO always, by the way, enlarged. In the early 50s, Greece and Turkey were not founding members. In 55, Germany. In the 80s, Spain. But in fact, there was a new context after the end of the Cold War. What to do with how to build the security architecture of the post-Cold War, post-Cold War Europe and the world in a way. And that brings me to enlargement, but I will be talking about it more in the discussion about Ukraine. So that was the 1990s. The 21st century, in a way, started for NATO not on the 1st of January of 2000 or 2001 even. It actually, I think, started in September of 2001. With terrorist attacks against the United States, and in fact, it was a historical moment for NATO because, believe it or not, it was actually the first time the article, Article 5, which I mentioned at the beginning, the one which says that in case there is an attack on one, everyone else will be ready to consider and provide help. This is exactly what happened. On the 12th of September, one day after the terrorist attacks, NATO, for the first time in its history, invoked Article 5. And then, and of course, did all sorts of things in support of the United States, providing, support, but also ultimately taking over the operation in Afghanistan, which was launched by the United States, against the Taliban regime, which refused to cooperate and hand over Osama bin Laden, who was back then on Afghan territory. And in fact, the first decade or slightly more than a decade of the 21st century was exactly that, responding to taking a more global role, if you will. It's not that NATO became a global organization. No, that was never our ambition and our goal. But we had to admit that in fact, current threats, they can emanate from any part of the world, and therefore, if you want to be relevant in addressing them, you have to make sure that you can also act globally, and that's exactly what NATO was doing, by participating in Afghanistan, having the longest and the largest mission actually in Afghanistan for years, which now which was actually the fighting mission was put an end in 2014, and we still have a mission. Training mission, which now also goes under transformation, and we can talk about it later. So that was the second post-war Cold War decade. But we again, had to come to grips with the fact that somehow the fact that we have new threats doesn't necessarily mean that the old ones are gone, and that brings me to the changes at the turn, or actually in the second decade of the 21st century, and that is especially relevant for Ukraine, and I will talk about it later. But in fact, what we found out. We were in a totally different situation suddenly after the Russian aggressive action against Ukraine in 2014, illegal and illegitimate annexation of Crimea, and supporting hybrid war campaign against the Ukrainian government in the east of Ukraine. And we again had to react to it, adapt to it. We did a number of things. Let me just enumerate a number of them, and that brings me to the second part, where I want to talk about current agenda, but also our relationship with Russia. First, we did something that we hoped would never have to do, which is that we deployed allied troops on the territory of new member states. In fact, in 1997, we signed a document with Russia which says that under current circumstances we would not deploy nuclear weapons, which we keep, and we would also not deploy substantial combat forces on the territory of member states. We did deploy combat forces on the territory of, in particular, of the three Baltic nations and Poland, where you have now, military presence by allies. It's a significant presence, but it's not threatening as Moscow would like to paint it. And the reason is precisely to make sure that if there is a temptation to somehow threaten or challenge security and territorial integrity of member states, that such an attempt is met with immediate response. And that's exactly the reason why we are all member countries on a rotational basis, but there are lead nations, for example, Germans in Lithuania, Canadians in Latvia, the Americans in Poland, to make sure that if there is a conflict, it's a conflict with the entire alliance from day one. Yeah? So that's what we did, and there are other things we also did in the sort of southeast direction, especially in the Black Sea region, where we are very closely working also with Ukraine and other partner countries, in particular Georgia. But let's not forget that we have actually 3 littoral states, part of the 4 actually, Bulgaria, Romania, Greece, and Turkey, part of the Black Sea situation. So that's one thing. The second thing is what we did in response to Russia's illegitimate actions vis-a-vis Ukraine was that we significantly revisited the entire approach to Russia. In fact, if you look at the what NATO has been trying to do with Russia is to make sure that Russia, despite the fact that we always had differences, that on the main strategic issues that we are partners. In fact, in the still valid strategic concept of 2010, you will find a sentence that NATO aspires to a strategic partnership with Russia. Well, this, unfortunately, I have to say that this particular sentence has been overtaken by events. We are, I would argue, in the worst situation with Russia since the end of the Cold War, if not since the advent even of Mikhail Gorbachev to the Kremlin in 1985. And of course, in response to that, we did 2 things. First of all, we said we suspended all practical civilian and military cooperation with Russia, which was actually quite successful, believe it or not. We used to cooperate, we used to work together in Afghanistan. We had a number of counterterrorism projects. And, we can talk about it in more detail in the Q&A session. We also, so rather than aspiring to strategic partnership, our policy vis-a-vis Russia is defense, deterrence, and dialogue. Defense and deterrence, is what I said, deploying troops in the east and in the southeast, enhancing our presence in the Black Sea. But we also said we do not want this crisis to deteriorate. We do not want, this to continue. Therefore, we need to talk to each other. So that is part of the that's the policy, which is the dialogue part, if you will. Basically, that the fora we have, in particular the NATO-Russia Council, which was created under a different name in the late 1990s, would be used precisely for a dialogue with Russia. Dialogue not in terms of really cooperation, but making sure that we do not misunderstand each other. And that dialogue has certain rules. And one of them is that the first topic we always will discuss in the framework of NATO-Russia is, it will be of interest to you, is Ukraine. In the situation in and around Ukraine, just to make sure that they understand that Moscow understands that we will never recognize illegal and illegitimate annexation of Crimea, that we strongly and unanimously condemn the illegal aggressive actions by Russia vis-a-vis your country, and that we are united in that condemnation. The Russians don't like that. They actually say, well, NATO has nothing to do with what has happened in the Crimea. Ukraine is not a member country. Why should we discuss Ukraine or what is happening, what the Russians say is an internal conflict in Ukraine with NATO? Well, we disagree. We believe that you know, there is an ongoing, and I mean, this needs no further explanation, you know, ongoing aggression against Ukraine, which actually, as we speak, there are some worrying developments on the Russian side. So anyway, so that's how we see it. But beyond that, we are ready to discuss with Russia other issues such as military transparency and risk reduction measures, you know, which is basically making sure that we have a bit more transparency as far as, for example, Russian exercises are concerned. You know, it's amazing that international observers have not been invited to one single, under the sort of mandatory regime, which I don't want to bother you with details, but we can delve into it, if you will, in the Q&A session. That that international observers have not been invited to one single Russian exercise after the end of the Cold War. Whereas our exercises are open, you know, they are publicized, and the Russian observers are always present if they decided to participate. We also discuss other things with Russia. However, I have to say that even on the dialogue part, we have been recently having difficulty in the sense that the NATO-Russia Council has not met since the summer of 2019, although there is a standing invitation to have such a meeting. So frankly, our dialogue has not been very successful, and not for the lack of trying, because we believe that it's part of the overall policy, together with deterrence. Now that brings me to our relationship with Ukraine. The first thing to say is that if there is one consistency in NATO's policy vis-a-vis Ukraine, it is that we have always supported whatever choice Ukraine made vis-a-vis NATO. You know, in the 1990s, Ukraine was the first country actually to become a NATO partner. In 1997, we signed together, or created, or lifted our relationship to a higher level by something we call distinctive partnership. You know, to make sure that countries such as of an importance of Ukraine, has a proper seat at the NATO table. And with that, we had a number of practical cooperation projects, including, Ukraine has consistently been one of the, if not at some point, the only partner country who contributed to all NATO operations. Ukraine, for example, was present from day one in Bosnia. In Kosovo, it provided help in Afghanistan. So it's much appreciated. When Ukraine in 2002, and this is very important because there is a lot of misunderstanding in the West mainly, maybe not in Ukraine, but in fact in 2002, Ukraine said that she wanted to be part of NATO. Because in the West, many think that this was only that Ukraine's desire to join NATO came only after the Orange Revolution. No, it was under President Kuchma in May 2002. By the way, it was the same thing with Georgia, where who also said that she wanted to be a member of NATO in 2000, before the Rose Revolution. It was actually under President Shevardnadze. And in response to that, we said, okay, this is your desire. We will support you. We will provide you help, assistance you need. So let's see. Ultimately, the decision, to enlarge NATO is NATO's, belongs to NATO, and no other country, frankly. on the basis of performance, of meeting certain requirements, which I will talk about later. When after the Orange Revolution, when to be honest with you, I said that it was under Kuchma that Ukraine said she wanted to be NATO, but in fact it was more words than deeds. When after the Orange Revolution, there was marked improvement and genuine effort actually to join NATO. Again, we provided all sorts of practical aid, number of mechanisms. The names are not important. That's more of sort of bureaucratic mechanisms, or not bureaucratic in the sense that they would be inefficient, but it's too much of a detail. So we have been supporting, and we also did one thing that I think is totally, I would say, unique in NATO's history. That in 2008 at the Bucharest summit, NATO said, not only to Ukraine, by the way, but also to Georgia, that they would, that they will become members. In the communique from the Bucharest summit, it says, today we agreed that Ukraine and Georgia will be members, which is really unique. And I remember, as I said, I've been covering Ukraine for 20 years, and I remember the debates back then. It's whenever the focus in Ukraine was entirely focused on whether Ukraine would receive a membership action plan or not. And in fact, the decision was not to give a membership action plan, which is again a tool, but in fact, what Ukraine received at the Bucharest summit was basically a political commitment that at some point there will be members. No other country, actually including my country, until the invitation at the Madrid summit in 1997 had that. And in fact, if you look at the annual national program, which was launched after the Bucharest summit, it's very similar in structure and objectives to the membership action plan. Now, again, as I said, we always respected the choice, whatever choice Ukraine made. When in 2010, under Yanukovych, Ukraine decided to take off NATO membership, take it off the agenda. We said this is fine. This is ultimately Ukraine's choice and decision. But we expect from you two things. First, that you will keep contributing to NATO's operations and work with us, and second, that you will continue with reforms in the interests of making Ukraine a prosperous, democratic country ruled by law. Basically, under the Yanukovych government, on the first point, I have to say that Ukraine did continue to contribute to NATO's operation. However, it slipped. It failed to deliver on the second item, which was basically continue reforming the country. Under Yanukovych, Ukraine was easily the most corrupt country in Europe, unfortunately. We can say it now. Again, when after the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, Ukraine restored NATO membership as its foreign policy goal, we said again, well, this is your choice, we respect it, and we will help you meet your objectives. We in fact did a number of things. First of all, we significantly boosted our presence in Kiev. Our civilian presence in Kiev is by far the biggest in any partner country. The mission we had, the NATO representation in Ukraine, now brings together almost 50 people, including defense advisors provided by member countries. Our office, NATO information Information and Documentation Center, to whom I would like to use this opportunity to thank them for organizing this this lecture. We set up a number of trust funds in the interests of helping in support of Ukraine defense and security sector reform, but not only reform, but also boosting Ukrainian armed forces. So it's actually quite. I think nobody can blame us for not delivering on our words. That we didn't put our money where our mouth was, as they say in English. So we supported and have been supporting Ukraine in all its ambitions, also supporting entirely its territorial integrity and sovereignty politically, but also providing practical help to Ukraine, not only via NATO, but also individual member countries. Just this month, the Americans, U.S. Congress agreed another chunk of providing Ukraine with lethal military weapons, which are necessary for its campaign in the East. Other member countries provide significant aid. We exercise jointly with Ukraine. We provide significant support to its effort to rebuild its navy after the annexation of Crimea, which also meant basically, annexation of most of Ukraine naval power. So I think, there has been a lot, but there is also a lot to expect from Ukraine, in particular in the fight against, because NATO enlargement is not just the military joining, but it's the whole country. And that's why already in the 1990s, there were certain criteria formulated. Political, military, and economic. Political, economic, and military. Political is that a country is a functioning democracy with the rule of law, which means basically that corruption is kept at the bare minimum, or sort of acceptable level, which, as you know, is still a challenge in Ukraine. In fact, NATO is helping fight that particular scourge in the framework of a number of programs, including building integrity, in particular focusing on the defense and security sector. The second criterion is that that a country can bear the burden of membership, that it not only takes from NATO, but also contributes. And the same for military, that somehow its armed forces are capable of working together with NATO, which in Ukraine's case, has been the case, at least for significant parts of the Ukrainian military who have been involved in NATO's operation. So, where are we now? Well, we are in a situation where we have a lot of expectations of Ukraine, in particular in the fight against against corruption, about reforming the country. And by the way, pursuing a reform is not just something that Ukraine needs to do for NATO. No, it's something that Ukraine needs to do for itself. And for us as well, because we believe that a prosperous, non-corrupt Ukraine, democratic, prosperous Ukraine, is actually a key to European security and stability. I will stop here. As usual, I spoke longer than I thought and hoped, but I think we still have, slightly less than 20 minutes for questions and answers. You can, ask them via Zoom, or you can do it in the chat box as you wish. So please. Now you can you can take we can turn the tables, so to speak, and you can ask questions, and I'll try to give you an honest answer to the extent I can. Thank you.
So, may I start?
Absolutely.
So, good afternoon.
Is it
my
Julia?
name is-
Julia,
Yes,
yeah. Okay.
Julia. Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to ask you, do you really believe in a productive and effective dialogue with Russia government that can lead to a peace, or without any aggressive actions? Because after almost 7 years of war, it seems like this war will never end without effective action.
Look, I think our dialogue, you have to, it's not dialogue for the sake of dialogue. The purpose of the dialogue is to show that we are united in our resolve to do what it takes to defend our member countries, that we are united in our condemnation in what Russia has done and is doing to Ukraine, and that its hybrid actions against our member countries will not go unnoticed and unpunished. Yes, Ukraine is, of course, in stage of a sort of hot war in a way, but let's not forget that our member countries have been subject of sorts of hybrid aggression by Russia as well, being it undermining our democratic processes, financing extremist parties, supporting and actually conducting, not only supporting, but conducting active misinformation campaign in our countries, also including in the sort of COVID context. So, I do believe that such a dialogue, where ultimately, it's not a dialogue that we used to have, where we were trying to find common interests and common ground. No. Our dialogue is basic exchange of views, making sure that the Russians understand our take, and I do believe that such a dialogue makes sense. We have to talk to each other, because we do not want this conflict to deteriorate even further. And including through that dialogue, we also deliver what we make very clear what our take is on the current situation in the sort of Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Yes, thank you. And of course it's important to make a Russian soldier leave Ukrainian lands, but personally, I think the most important is to clean up people's brain, Ukrainian people's brain from a Russian impact, and it's really hard to do.
Yeah, yes, but I wouldn't be so pessimistic. It is difficult, absolutely. But if you look at the progress made, since 2013-14, not only in terms of Ukrainian armed forces. Look, under Yanukovych, the Ukrainian armed forces were in a terrible state, because, well, most money was stolen by him and people around him. If you look at your Ukrainian, at your armed forces today, they are a force to be reckoned with. And I think the Russians know full well that a full-scale conflict with the Ukrainian forces would not, because they used to say, well, we'll be in Kiev in 3 days. I think they had to reconsider that. And so that's one thing. But in terms of cleaning people's brain, I think also, if you look at how people understand what is happening, let me put it in the NATO-Ukraine context. I remember, when under Yushchenko, and basically until 2013, support among, because regardless of what was done really in the sort of reforming, the society was never sure whether they wanted to join NATO. I think until 2014, 13, 14, the public support for NATO membership in Ukraine was never above 30%. Yeah? If you look at the figures now, it's actually about 50. And not if you count those who say, and I will actually go to the polls and cast a vote, it's about 70%. So I think there has been a sort of movement. If I understood your question correctly, I think there has been a movement. But I think there need a bit more effort, or continued effort needs to be made in terms of fighting corruption, including in the defense and security sector. Having clearly the civil society involved in all that effort, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. Any other question?
Yes, sir.
Please, Olesya, yeah?
Yes, I'm a professor of this university, and I have two
very good.
Stupid or childish question, and this is the luxury of being a professor.
or a lecturer.
Or a lecturer, yeah. So Ukraine wants to be a member of NATO. You say yes, but please have systematic reforms. Ukraine makes a little steps. Presidents come and go, but problem remains. My first question is, aren't you afraid that if Ukraine joins NATO, it brings its mentality with it into NATO? Question number two. Can you name me a country that used to have this rooted, corrupted reputation, and then it joins NATO, and then miracle happens, and this country becomes like an example of dignity and honor? Thank you.
Well, first of all, your question is not childish at all. Your question is very good, and that's the way it should be. And by the way, there is no such as a silly question. There are only silly answers. So you are safe. You can ask a question, and I'll try to to do that. Well, first of all, the reason why we have and you have a point. We do not want corruption being imported to NATO, to the West, if you will. We actually, in some of our countries, including mine, we worked very hard to fight that. I mean, your challenge is bigger. But that's precisely the reason why we have to make sure that, for example, that the judiciary system, which I think still needs major reform, needs to be part of that reform, and the support we provide to Ukraine is precisely in that respect, to make sure that these reforms actually deliver. So I think Ukrainian mentality, I don't know what it is. What I see here is about 25, 30 people who, if you were not speaking, Ukrainian or Russian, I wouldn't know whether you are from the West or from which part of the world you are. I don't think there is anything like a Ukrainian mentality. Well, there is, of course, there is Czech mentality, and that's the beauty of NATO and the international organization, that we are still, citizens and of our countries. But I don't think that there is something wrong with the Ukrainian mentality. What needs to, but to be more serious, I think what really needs to be done is focus on reforms. The civil society, which needs to push to put pressure on bureaucratic structures which have their own vested interests to reform, because this is ultimately in the interests of your nation and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think and frankly, a lot has been done. I mean, in terms of setting up structures, to fight corruption, particularly, like NABU and others. They have to make them, but now of course the vested interests fight back. So now it's the challenge for for the Ukrainian democratic elected representatives, but also for the civil society to make sure that the hopes are not failed again. Okay. Now a few questions from the chat box. What would you say is the end goal for NATO's work in Ukraine? Say we clear things up with Russia in general, on even term. Well, look, our ultimate goal of Ukraine is, and I think in that respect, our goals coincide entirely, which is a stable, prosperous, democratic, uncorrupt Ukraine, which is key to Ukraine stability, to European stability. Whether that takes place, in the context of NATO membership is not necessarily 100% identical with that. I mean, it can be, the Ukrainians can decide whatever they want, but also NATO can decide. I mean, we have but I think, what our ultimate goal is what I said. And ultimately, and what we say to Russia, it is the Ukrainians' choice. It is not, it is not your choice and Ukrainians' choice to choose that particular direction, and for NATO to actually arrive at a consensus to enlarge NATO. And by the way, we have been, over the last few years, again, we have been, inviting new countries, lately Montenegro and the North Macedonia, the Republic of North Macedonia. So there is clearly, the enlargement process is ongoing, but in fact, I think if in a way, Russia by what she did, pushed in a way Ukraine towards NATO, because remember when during the revolution of dignity. NATO membership was not an issue. It was, formally speaking, not on the agenda, and there was even nothing actually anti-Russian in the revolution of dignity, in the Maidan. It was a revolt against corrupt system. The fact that system was linked with equally corrupt system in Russia is a different matter, but it had nothing to do with basically it was, I think it was you may agree and you may disagree with me, but I think it was a revolt but against corrupt system and the direction where that corrupt system was actually taking Ukraine. How can the younger generation help NATO? Well, I think the young generation can help Ukraine, and then the question is from Abigail, Abigail Regionova. I think it's really important that you take part in making sure that the country goes in the right direction in terms of reforming, in terms of where you would like your country to be, and of course by that you are helping NATO as well, because as I said, our goal is ultimately prosperous, stable, sovereign Ukraine, which also exercises full responsibility on its entire territory, including Donbass, eastern part of Donbass, but also Crimea. I'm afraid I will have to stop here because I have, as I said, I have another meeting. Let me thank you very much for your attention. Hope this is not the last time. I will be ready to, in the future again to meet with you virtually, if not in person. Let me wish you all the best in your professional and private lives, and good luck, and Slava Ukraini. Yeah.
Героям слава.
All the best. Sure. I know.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you everyone for this time. I hope that we will be able to see everyone on Friday. Okay.
The same time?
Yes, the same time at
Mhm.
2 p.m.
Okay. See you soon.
Okay. Have a good day. Bye.
Have a good day. Goodbye.
But